So this topic is very revealing. So look at my first slide here with the pictures I've put together as I prepared today, right? So you have Safaricom, this iconic company that you know when you're in Kenya, definitely, but also when you and other countries, or you follow development debates and Afro-capitalism debates or Afro-optimism debates. Safaricom is often used as an example of Afro-optimism and of the success of Kenya, and that Safaricom gave the world this innovation of M-Pesa and so on. So Safaricom is a brilliant example to study the new capitalism and the politics of the new capitalism, really. So here the pictures I just took out of the screenshots and so on today. In the middle, if you concentrate on the one in the middle, is the stadium, in Nairobi, and there you have a lot of Safaricom adverts, and of course other venues also kind of Safaricom venues. And then you have on the right, you have Ruto shaking hands here with Safaricom CEO or key manager and so on, who has just been appointed also to as you see here, Ruto appoints Safaricom CEO, at the bottom, CEO Peter Ndegwa to head National Steering Committee on Drought Response. And then you see other headlines: Safaricom installs Ruto-friendly management team. So this appointment thing, Ruto, government, Safaricom. On the other side, you see some pictures talking about how many shares Ruto has in Safaricom, how rich he gets thanks to Safaricom and so on. And then another picture, Safaricom expanding into Ethiopia, and also trying to seek to make a lot of money there and give it to the shareholders and be successful there, of course, making customers happy, right? So I'm getting into this in detail in a moment. So that's my opening slide. So it's about the end of the Cold War, African implication. That's a large story. So 90s onwards, wherever you have been around that time, So in UK, it's usually the story of Thatcher and Blair, and then New Labour and so on. But in other places, other politicians are tied to this story. In Uganda, Museveni, for instance, right? So that's picture the 90s, 2000, 2010s onwards up to now. I didn't want to give you a story of the 90s, mainly the structural adjustment, the breaking down of the cooperatives and so on. I've also watched the 8 lecture, so you're familiar with SAPS and how devastating it was to the continent and producing ruins in many ways and really making development tasks and so on very difficult for many people and in many sectors, right? So I get to that in a moment, but I want to give you another story, which is the new thing that emerged out of the destruction and out of the crisis of SAPS is a capitalism that has very particular economic features and political features. And I want you to see them and be able to confidently study them, unpack them, because the mainstream, the UN, the governments in Kenya and Uganda, and elsewhere, they will not give you the politics. They will talk about all this as if it's just pure economics. And of course, we know it's not. And so I'm trying to make the point here that seeing the politics is really revealing and interesting and worth your time, and is an important skill as a graduate of this module. That's my opening remark. Does that make sense so far? Yeah. I'm always, I don't see you now. I just continue with my slides. Yeah.
Yes.
So, okay. So if anything breaks down, text me, Nigel. Yeah. I have my phone here with WhatsApp, so I can see if there's anything not working. You let me know.
Yes, sir.
On WhatsApp, because I don't have any chats popping up. So just my research areas are neoliberalism. Then I study neoliberal moral order, right, which is capitalist moral order, and moral change that comes with neoliberalization. So in Uganda, that's my case that I studied as a PhD student. I studied economic fraud, and again, the moral economy of fraud, so cheating in business, economic crimes, but the moral underpinning, the moral milieu and climate that enables fraudulent activity in the economy. I studied anti-fraud measures. So when the state says we want to fight fake seeds, what happens? And then lately I've moved to 2 new topics. One is commercialization. And here I study football in particular, and I'm generally broadly interested in capitalism in Africa, right? And this is about entertainment or sports capitalism, or you might also call it leisure capitalism, but I use the term entertainment or sports capitalism. And then the second topic is economic pressure or stress in the city. So that's about the mental aspects, the bodily pain people experience, sleeplessness, ulcer, all the stuff that indicates there's pressure and stress in people's bodies and minds related to the economic experiences and situations they find themselves in. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's my range of topics. They're all interrelated, and they all come out of 20 years of research in Uganda, and then in the last 4 or 5 years also in Kenya. Okay, and personally, just positionality, right? I'm German, but I'm East German. So for me, the transformation story and the after the Cold War is my personal story as well, and intrigues me a lot, right? Because I'm studying capitalism, yet I grew up in socialism, right? So for me, capitalism is always intriguing, analytically speaking, because it's not my system, right? I have a distance to it. My state is no more, my system is no more, and so on. So that's very intriguing to me. Of course, I study in Uganda, so it's not my country, right? So that's a strange combination there of things, but also very intriguing, and I'm privileged to be able to do that combination and that journey from, the transformation you see here, and now studying basically capitalism. And my topic, they could also work, of course, in Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe. That's why also sometimes I work with colleagues to study, for instance, the moral changes in Eastern Europe, given my positionality as well. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, and I did economics in Germany, but then I went to do political economy in Warwick, down here, south of England. But I was always intrigued. I did a trade module, and I was intrigued in African politics and why is Africa poor and so on. So I was lucky to go to the UN as an intern, and then in Vienna, and they had a mentor from Sierra Leone, and she sent me on her project as a junior consultant to Kampala. So it's a bit like you, some of you who have done that, yeah. So I was in Kampala, Ministry of Trade, so also not an embassy or GIZ or DFID office, but the Ministry of Trade and Industry and Cooperatives office for 1.5 years, and then I did some consultancy before I started the PhD in Sheffield about the neoliberal moral economy of fraud in Uganda. And then, yeah, so do you see here, Cold War, that's also the end of Cold War, the 90s onwards. I'm familiar with things also at a personal level, what transformation means, right? And I've now been in Leeds for 10 years, and also I'm lucky to be a senior research associate at the University of Joburg. These are the books I did, and with colleagues, edited volumes, right? So neoliberalism, moral economy of fraud, capitalism and economic crime in Africa, but also then Uganda in particular, neoliberal transformation. And then a new book here on oral history of work under capitalism, on the neoliberal capitalism, so people's biographies, if you like, of the last 20, 30 years. So these are my research interests. I mentioned already pressure in the city. I added a blog, Capitalism in Africa, and then down here you see this blog on Ugandan football. So I didn't want to just continue studying fraud, right, for 20, 30 years, or agriculture, etc. I'm happy now I've educated myself about football and commercialization, and also opened and developed this pressure in the city argument. So, and now I have colleagues who work in media, and then at some point we got to this point where we studied fintech and how fintech is covered in the African press, whether it's a success story with little politics or what's going on. So that's why I now also study a bit fintech. But overall, I'm a student of, or scholar of, capitalism in Africa, neoliberalism in particular, and of course, therefore, also these transformations after the Cold War in the African context. And my own research starts in 2005, roughly, right? But I've covered in my book also the entire post-Cold War era dynamics for my sector that I studied, coffee in Uganda. But today I give you a very particular focused kind of fintech talk, yeah? But I'll give you some slides also about neoliberalism. So far, can you follow? Am I talking? Yeah?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So the readings I've given you, right? So just talk you through here. So there's Harrison, who he was my supervisor in Sheffield, and that article kind of opened up so much for me here. This first article, because there he defines neoliberalism in a very particular way, and what neoliberal dynamics and transformations after, if you like, again after the Cold War are about. He gives us a very good definition, very good analytical perspective that is very productive in my view, and I've keep using that, and my own work builds on that. So I want you to just context, right? The other key readings are Arrighi. Nigel said you have been, or this Arrighi article has been shown to you. I don't know if you have read it, but if you want to contextualize neoliberalism a bit, I recommend you check Arrighi, African crisis and so on, for context. And that explains a bit the particularities of the African position in the world economy and why there's always imposition of policies and so on. And then Harrison here, again, it's just a brief check, So especially his definition that, of course, I will pull out or emphasize again a bit later, but I recommend reading that article or browsing it, right? Then the other article we did on Afro-optimism and fintech and so on. So here you don't have to read the entire article, but it's good to read the opening 4 or 5 pages that summarize for you the debate about fintech. And what the authors are saying is the politics in a way, So what some authors say, this is all exploitative and racial capitalism and colonialism and so on, and other authors say it's all wonderful and reduces poverty and so on, And so Bateman is one of the next block here, very short, is one of the critics who say this is all very bad stuff, and basically neo-colonial, and the poor in Kibera, when they use their mobile phones and pay M-Pesa and so on fees, they basically enrich the rich shareholders of Safaricom who sit somewhere abroad on the tax havens and so on, So he makes a link there between local and global. But that is not even my core concern today. I want to move on even to this other point that Park and Donovan make about nation, state, statecraft, and Safaricom. And then I found we're working on a second article about fintech, where we try to say how fintech represents a particular Afro-optimism, and we want to understand the underpinning and the PR, if you like, of that, but not just the PR, also the discursive and so on underpinnings of that Afro-optimism related to fintech. So now I found new authors that have just come up with some good, really strong papers. I like them a lot, which is the last one here, Kirolia and co-authors. Fintech frontiers and so on. So they try to understand. They are urban Africa scholars sitting in Cape Town, and they try again to not just say, they say Bateman is right in some ways, but there's more to this than the colonialism and neocolonialism story, right? And Africans are not just pawn in global capitalism, and you can't just say everything is reduced to you're serving you're being exploited by foreign capital and so on. So they try to say there's more to fintech. And I think that's productive and important and right. And here they say they have some interesting arguments that I talk about later. So I recommend these texts. How much time you have is up to you, of course. But then there are other readings. So if you want to find Harrison good, you can go and read chapter 1 in his 2010 book. If you want to have a better grip on neoliberalism, right? You don't need that for the assignment, but just in case you want to.
Are the first 5 ones all in the downloads?
I've sent Nigel. I've sent my, the blogs are there, right? You can just access them. Park and Donovan as well. The Between the Nations.
Harrison, I saw. I was not checking the rest. So, but cool.
Harrison is there. The other chapters of the first 4 are there. The journal articles I've given the PDFs to Nigel.
Cool. Thanks.
So if you need others, let me know. I don't know how this is organized, but we can always get the others as well. So you look. So if you go to further readings, so Polio and Kirolia again have talked about fintech urbanism and the startup capital of Africa. So then Park with her making of the corporate nation state, Safaricom, right? And you see how Safaricom and Kenya, etc., are very prominent in this analysis. There are not many texts, right? So that's why I'm really happy that they are kind of clustering around the Kenyan question and the politics, etc. There's also this important work by Bagat, who goes into refugee camps and so on, and basically the UN and other aid organizations telling people to basically join the fintech thing, right? And say we send you money on mobile phones or whatever. So he talks about, you see the article there by Bagat and Roderick, yeah, banking on refugees, racialized expropriation in the fintech era. Good. So those of you who are in NGO sectors, maybe you'll find that interesting. Bagat's work. He's also done a book now. But anyway, so that's all about politics in a way of fintech and of that new capitalism. And then ties as well with, we call that political settlement theory, political settlement reading of the Kenya's M-Pesa success story. So basically elite analysis, also very important, yeah? Okay. And now Park, yeah, and Park and Donovan really did a great article. I just read it, last week. So it's my ongoing research when I read it for our second article there on the called techno-political Afro-optimism in fintech. So they have new books coming out, or they just came out this month, I think. So both now with monographs on this, that partly also is about fintech and money and sovereignty and politics. So they are very good authors and books. So if you have some spare money, I wait till I find some money. You should maybe have a look at that, or at least try to find out what they say in the book. Good, yeah. So that's it, so that's it. Now that's my journey. I want to give you, after the 8 story and the sub story, I want you to see a little bit. And I want to put on the table here this important topic of understanding the new capitalism and seeing it really. And when I was over the years, when I talked about neoliberalism, I always show students things like this, right? Look at these shows here: Battle for Cash, talent show in East Africa's Got Talent show, right? Of course, similar formula, etc., and script to the. I think it's copyrights come from whoever owns this show format, right? Then Museveni having Coke with the Coca-Cola CEO. Then school. Stanbic Bank, yeah, multinational from South Africa, sponsoring school competition and property shows and millionaire shows and so on. So question would be, and then here, Sauti Sol being sponsored by ABSA. So what do you think my pictures are trying to tell you, or what is the commonality or the link here?
Sorry, I always forget how to raise my hand, but
can't see hands and so on. I just have my own slides open, yeah, and then I talk.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe how kind of financial institutions and financial dynamics are kind of underlying in many bits of society, and like money as a driving force.
Yeah, very good. So the importance of financial actors, yeah, or institutions, banks, and others.
Or like even multinationals like Coca-Cola and stuff, or like, as you said, like people who actually have the rights of these type of shows. Mm-hmm. Whoever is that, probably big TV like companies, yeah.
Yeah, transnationals most likely, right? Very rich companies most likely. Mm-hmm. So there's money. You mentioned money. Other ideas? Can other students come in?
Yes, I see here, for example, a domination of culture. So it's an expression of what people consume and what is put there out for the people in the culture. So neoliberalism and capitalism goes inside the culture and the mentality of the people.
Yeah, very good. So money, culture, yeah, mentality, what I sometimes call in my own work moral milieus, yeah, or cultural milieus. We have this term also, the culture of capitalism. So that is maybe, is it increasing or decreasing in these localities and contexts that I'm having? Increasing, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Totally. Also because like often government, or at least I wanted to say government doesn't have funds, but it seems government doesn't have funds, or the government shows that it doesn't have funds. So other institutions take over. For example, the example here with the school, like kind of school activities being sponsored by private companies. instead of government structures.
Okay, yeah, so austerity and limited public funds, so the corporation steps in, yeah? The corporation takes over certain roles that maybe 20, 30 years ago they wouldn't have done. Not and stomach anyway wasn't in Uganda then, arguably, and so on, yeah? So there's money, but also the power of the corporation, the social dominance of the corporation, and the corporation is kind of unquestioned in a way. It seems normal, that you have sponsorships from corporations for each and everything almost, right? Including religious activities and so on. So anyone else with the final shot? Yeah, money, culture, corporations, the state, yeah, is also there, but kind of in particular ways. Okay.
But can I just say that there's also a doctrine here of like high capitalism being quite paternalistic, I see as well. Just
Where would that be? Which picture?
I see on all of them.
Paternalistic.
Yeah, like to reach this level of actualization, actually, you need capital. Capital is kind of looming over everyone and everything.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, exactly. So I always think in the end it's about Hunger Games, right? So it's almost like a Hunger Games metaphor. You need capital, you need the corporation, you want to be adopted, found out as a star, you have to shine and so on, and then capital decides who they want to promote and make a millionaire and pull out of poverty and so on. So yeah, so this paternalistic and also, I mean, there's also something about salty soul. So the biggest in the land, yeah, they endorse APSA. They're not saying no, we don't get any. They go with the APSA used to be Barclays before. So this is British capitalism, right? As far as imperialism and colonialism story. So all this Barnaby now doing advertisement for whiskey, for Hennessy, and so on. So you can't have better endorsement partners, right? Sort of also. And then also this mixing, right? You got a Kenyan culture then, and it's very intriguing stuff always. Okay, cool. Paternalistic dominance, right? Hegemonic, you might say, corporate hegemony of the corporation, and so on. So expansive, institutionalized corporate culture, yeah, as well. Good. Where's my moving on? Okay, so battle for cash. So this was some of these pictures are 10 years old, right? And I was intrigued when I was a researcher when they so explicit as well, right? So kind of normative in many ways as well, yeah. And you find this again and again. Airtel, money, they run particular competitions and shows, and you can win and so on. And here also, MTN sponsors. They have a competition. Who's the biggest fan of Uganda? Who wants to be the sponsored fan from us? So they give them money, and now he and his group there, the winner, is a kind of commercial entity in the stadium supporting Uganda and so on. So all this is intriguing stuff and has a lot of power to, of course, corporate culture, capitalist culture in the US, right? The mother of capitalism culture and so on, I think, and other places. So it's also worth comparing countries within Africa and other places. So how do we get here, right? So that's a bit the story of post-Cold War, the rise to dominance of the corporation, etc. Yeah, and here's a picture with Museveni, with the World Bank boss and UN boss. So it's an intriguing story of how different agencies co-produced this sort of what I call, what we might call the new capitalism in Africa. So these are neoliberalism, right? So we need to understand neoliberalism. And I said RE is a good context article. If you haven't read it, try to read it before next summer, yeah, sort of, before you end the module or the degree or walk away from this university. So it's really intriguing article. It gives you a lot of tools to think and analyze. Then I have other pictures that again make a similar point that I just made. So there are money and markets. There's a show out there in Uganda. Very explicit stuff, right? There also Airtel and the selfie. So technology is very key. Then also this, as you say, the mind and selfie. There's a video here. You promote yourself. You narcissism and so on. And then village mall, the whole shopping malls are also very interesting in this context that we try to analyze this new capitalism, right? And its power and its politics. And there's a Freedom Heights Mall. So check if in Kampala there's also Freedom Mall, yeah. And of course, freedom is a very particular term and concept. If you tie it to capitalism, if you call your mall Freedom Mall, So I sometimes also ask my Chinese students here, do you have freedom or anything like that in China? Right? And that's a picture here. I took the one about apply over morning coffee, loan by lunch hour. So I took it in Nairobi. That to me shows a little bit that capitalism is very alive and kicking and culturally and so on. So sometimes colleagues, they talk always about crisis and always about resistance and always about when will capitalism be overthrown and how and when, by whom. But I sometimes try to trace rather the continued power and continued marketing and PR and cultural hegemony and so on of capitalism. Does that make sense? Yeah. So and how they say, look, you get your loan within a very short time if you apply and so on. Okay, so when you want to understand and have a grip on neoliberalism, you need to understand some definitions and concepts. Okay, fine. Key scholars, historical emergence and context, what, where, who, how, why, to what effect were things neoliberalized. Yeah, so what was neoliberalized, where, who did it, how, why, to what effect. So these are the questions you could ask. Of course, we will not talk about this in detail here, but this is how I would structure my thinking and my learning, right? When it comes to neoliberalism. And also important to keep in mind there's difference across time and space. So neoliberal Uganda in the 90s is different from 2024. And lots of similarities and differences also across countries and regions and so on. And then of course you have to ask, why is it useful to think about neoliberalism or to think about capitalism and the politics of capitalism? What's the usefulness of this term? And are we not already beyond neoliberalism, right? So that's also sometimes intriguing to think about what does a concept allow us to see, what is productive and useful, analytically speaking, this concept. So what does it allow us to see, to understand better, to shed light on, etc. So that's also good. So these are lots of the books, yeah, and then Harrison's book here, Neoliberal Africa, I recommend especially chapter 1. Yeah, then Poverty and Neoliberalism, another one. But Harrison is really good. And there are many other books that is kind of the global literature. Yeah, some authoritarian neoliberalism is one of these things. So these are all things that people have said about this post-Cold War period. Lots of key concept books. So lots of extremely globalization is one big topic in social science and African studies. The other one is neoliberalism. Yeah, and one or two others, but it's a big literature and confusing and tiring, yeah, in some ways. But here again, look at this term. I like this a lot because I use the same term, market civilization. You see that on the bottom right? So the argument that I also made in one of the blogs is that neoliberalism didn't just bring deregulation or liberalization, it institutionalized capitalist civilization, if you like, right? And the pillars of it, the culture, the politics of it. So here, market civilization is another term that people use. That we're living in this era where this is being embedded, expanded, intensified. Okay. So, properties of neoliberalism. I have about 10 minutes for this, and then I move on to fintech. Yeah. So it's a current variant of capitalism. People talk about it in terms of ideas, policies, ideologies, discourses, particular form of governmentality. Okay. So it's not just policies. It's also ideas. It's also discourse. It's also practices. Harrison talks a lot about the neoliberal practices. Of course, and then you can say there's an emphasis on marketization and corresponding transactional logics. So trying to make everything markets, commercialize it, water, your kids' education, and the burials. Yeah, there wasn't maybe commercialized burials and a burial business and sector 30 years ago. Now you have that. Now you can send also your kid to get training to how to be a social media star and so on. So things becoming extremely marketized. So social relations are exchange relations. They're transactional. You engage with each other because you have to transact something. You want to do business with each other, or you have to do business with each other. And it's about transformation of society into something where capital is really dominant over the other classes, right? And over society in particular. So capital is hegemonic, not questioned, not just ruling by coercion, but also by consent. People want to be millionaires. They want to have money. They agree with the culture and so on. So you could say also Harrison talks about the social engineering project. So all this is of course not natural, right? But it's steered, engineered, we call it, by political, economic, cultural, and other actors. They want to forge a market society or market civilization. So that alone is politics, right? Yeah. So if we are intrigued about the politics of the new capitalism after the end of the war, so we could ask and go into details of this engineering project, its different examples and layers and politics. It's about universalizing capitalist social relations. So you don't allow much else to coexist. It can coexist perhaps, but you are trying to universalize. That's what we say as analysts. That's what this is about, capitalism, and making it hegemonic. So you might have seen also the definition by Ben Fine, financialization, governing the self. Yeah, so saying you're responsible. The state is no more. You have to grab your life and run with it and become, work hard and so on. Nicholas Rose made that argument. So now the one that I use based on Harrison's definition is this one here, neoliberalism. Yeah? Maybe you can just read it for yourself. So the key thing is to say neoliberalization is about the creation of fully fledged market societies. Question then, of course, becomes when is neoliberalism over, or when is something else then that there's not neoliberalism. So it's a bit hard to conceptualize that.
So George, my,
Yeah.
my question is how do you escape all of this? Because the way I feel about it is like it's a bit like a matrix you're trapped in, right?
Yeah.
And for many people who see the matrix, we want to know if we should take the blue pill or the red pill.
Very good. That's what it is, right? So, and some people also say, even if there's a crisis of neoliberalism, a crisis of the system, and there are riots and this and that in London, the system will renew itself, and it will answer with more neoliberalism, right? The policies, it's a tightening and an intensification of capitalism, also in terms of refugee border controls and the rest, and more technology and more surveillance and so on. So it's just market society is a difficult thing to what you might want to call. So if it's embedded, how do you disembed? How do you deinstitutionalize neoliberalism? Yeah. And one thing one could study and think about this is, for instance, when communities decide we don't want to have corporate adverts in our public spaces, right? So then you have a small way in which one can escape from this or try to have political movements around. At least we don't want to have adverts or these kind of adverts in the underground. Do you understand? That's how in little ways, one can study deneoliberalization or etc. So changing the pill, if you like, a little bit. But it's very small stuff in many ways. And look at what happened to left-wing parties, right, in Europe and elsewhere, that promised to change the system significantly. So, of course, it's also about discourses. I give you a moment before, when I finish this, then I open up for questions before I go to fintech. Yeah. But it's advanced via policies, discourses on freedom, right? Also, freedom is highlighted, self-interest, free markets. And as I say, it's not just changes in the economy, but also polity, society, and culture. And you can see neoliberalism when you focus especially on social practice, yeah? Social practice. So then Harrison studies, for instance, the practices that are promoted by neoliberalism when it comes to the state, so that you have more consultation with the citizens, so a particular way of doing the state in terms of the practice. So he says, okay, you can analyze day and night the discourse or the ideas or the policies, but also the practices are important to check out. Creates particular norms, particular psychology, yeah, ways of thinking and feeling. And then people talk also about the new institutional architecture for managing capitalist social relations. So that's all to say it's institutionalized culturally, politically, and so on. It's locked in. We call it also locked in, naturalized. Good. And this is sometimes I have to summarize this neoliberalism literature also when I write, right? Like we have here a paper on the case for oral histories of neoliberalism, neoliberal Africa. So we summarize neoliberalism literature a little bit if you want to read further. Or here, there's another one. But the latest one is, for instance, in this case for oral histories paper, where we briefly summarize and argue that we are still living in neoliberalism and not in post-neoliberalism and so on. Good. The state in neoliberalism is about a market state, competition state. They call it like that, right? The analysts, they call it also corporate states. You see, again, it's pro-capital. That's the point. It's supposed to be removing obstacles to capital accumulation. Then people also study neoliberalism from below, where the Safaricom comes in a little bit. Yeah, people using mobile phones and being excited, but also, of course, stressed by it. It's a bit like studying it from below, how people get incorporated into neoliberalism, but also maybe resisting it.
I have a short question, if I might ask, or like maybe even you come to that later, but are you going to talk about maybe a difference in the way capitalism and neocolonialism is like is lived, or however, when you look at rural areas and like
Yeah, it's a good point.
like cities and stuff, because I feel like what you're talking about, especially in the Ugandan context, it's so much like Kampala, but like you drive 5 hours out or like 2 or whatever, and it's like a complete like different picture, like not complete, but I mean, you know what I mean, probably.
Yeah, that's why I try to, also as a disclaimer. So of course there are different time and place, right? So there's a colleague who studies with his team rural areas, eastern Uganda, Soroti, right? And how, nevertheless, the poor get drawn into neoliberalism by, for instance, projects, aid projects that say we give you some support, but you need a mobile app for us to send you the money. So it's a yes and no. Yes, it's different, but sometimes we still find also neoliberalism, of course, in the rural areas.
Yeah, especially mobile money is like everywhere, of course, but still it's
so but they're becoming financialized. They never have a mobile phone maybe before. Now the UN comes in with some project for them, but they say we have to work with you. You need a mobile money number and account and so on. So then that's one way to think about this. So it comes maybe later in different ways, but nevertheless sometimes these projects and these rollout of neoliberalism finds people eventually, not always. Yeah. But it's very worthwhile to think about how much capitalism is in rural areas and how much is something else going on.
Yeah, and by the way, not only in the African context, like worldwide, right?
Yeah,
so it's like not a
no, very true. So we call that coexistence with other systems, right? And including non-neoliberal or even anti. So they are coexistence question, yeah, and survival. So in capitalism, of course, the argument is not that everything gets killed and everything is kind of monocultural, but that's the trend. The trend is it's almost dictatorial, and they call it also, yeah, neoliberalism wants to go everywhere, capitalism wants to go everywhere. Anyway, so it's, but the whole point of my today's work with you is to say capitalism is destructive, sure, yeah, creates misery and closes factories and so on, but also productive. So there's not just Africa is one of the strongest growth at the moment, or even Uganda has a strong growth story, one of the top 10, 20 in the world, and so on. So there's physical infrastructure, they're building roads, they're giving you the mobile infrastructure, yeah, they're giving you the Wi-Fi, there's entertainment, technology, and finance. So you have to make something with that, not to praise capitalism, but to say, okay, so that maybe gives it its hegemony or longevity, or that's how the poverty is reduced a little bit here and there. And people, what I also call, buy into this. So I'm very interested also because there's not much data on the local popularity of capitalism. Of course, historically made, yeah, and force people to like it or to endorse and so on, the materialism of it to survive, and but it's also productive. Does that make sense? So the growth figures are not negative, yeah, and compared to the 80s and 70s, there are some different growth figures. Of course, investment comes in. You will have investment in Kampala and in Kenya, and so on. That's what I want to say. It produces boom and crisis. We call it also uneven development, and it has a degree of legitimacy, which is also Safaricom, to which I turn in a moment. Right? Yeah. So then maybe the other thing to know is everything comes in phases. So we call the 90s the rollback phase, where it was about reduction of the state, and then the next 10 years or so roll out neoliberalism, where it was about putting the institutions for this market society in place and changing the state accordingly. So not just reducing everything and shutting things down, but now you create maybe investment authority, export promotion board, free zone authority. Does that make sense? Yeah. So restructuring the state, reducing the state at first, and now you restructure the state so it can deliver this market society and market-based social order. That's maybe also good to keep in mind, including in the education sector and other places where you now have maybe more public-private partnership. So this again, Harrison, I don't want to, you can read that in your own, right? So here, and just to see how heavily this was manufactured, right? And also backed by science. So this is one of the make markets work for the poor graphics, right? And look at how many NGOs, how many scientists, how many projects, thousands and thousands have worked on this institutionalizing market society. Yeah, this is all post-Cold War era, right? And you wouldn't have this without the end of the Cold War, without the fall of the Soviet Union, without America thinking that's it, end of history, and so on stuff. Incredible stuff, right? About okay, this all works, markets are fine. You can put your faith on this. You can take, what is it, blueprint, or our pill is working. Just wait and so on. And we're working on it that this works. So and it still pops up all the time. So neoliberalism is not on the way out. You see these institutions also are created by the World Bank and others. PSFU, right? Private Sector Foundation Uganda, created by the World Bank and donors. They now celebrate 30 years of PSFU. Many institutions in Uganda, they now celebrate about 30, 40 years of their existence because they were created in the 90s, mostly, or 2000s, right? National Competitiveness Forum, now they have also free trade zone authority. So it's still very much, the project is on the road still. Yeah, finance, women, and so on. Giving World Bank or donor just announced they have a new growth project for women entrepreneurs in Uganda. You see here, Uganda Investment Authority, Uganda Free Zone Authority. This is all institutions that for us are symbols of neoliberalism, and they do the neoliberalism kind of work. Yeah. So that's Nairobi here, Nairobi Street Kitchen. If you go there, there's also the architecture, the way in which it's gated, the way in which everything is also interlinked, the apps, the entertainment, the delivery guys, and so on, right? Work and leisure and consumption, right? And profits, and who owns that place, and so on. All sorts of that. So now fintech. I bring you back a bit. I maybe stop screen sharing, yeah? Okay, yeah, so now my actual story starts. This was a bit neoliberalism, sorry, yeah, but from now on it's a bit like also easier. It's still a bit to go, but I thought I'd give you the neoliberalism to give you that theory as well, yeah? Is that good so far?
I would have maybe one question.
Yeah.
You said, maybe it's a stupid one, but you said without the end of the Cold War, this would all not be possible. But isn't it the case that even without the end of the Cold War, like the so-called non-aligned states were not really following a certain type, but were creating their like own way of following, sometimes the West, sometimes like the Russian way, or like the East, or however. So how, like, can you say like 2 more sentences about that? Like what do you think like gave that neoliberalism the push or whatever?
Yeah, but it wouldn't look like this. So it would still maybe in the end neoliberalism and capitalism and so on, but arguably this whole the confidence of capitalism and liberalism in the 90s and 2000s, and we're on the right track, and markets and liberal democracy is the way to go. End of history, yeah, Fukuyama. The West was full of confidence and was full of that missionary kind of stuff as well, and that is. So
like kind of with the fall of the Soviet Union, everyone was like, okay, this is the only way to go, and that gave it the push then.
That's one element of it. There are many other maybe pillars, but we just finished a paper on donors and aid in the 2010s, and there, of course, some of these iconic authors that talked about aid, Collier, Sachs, and promoted reforms. They promoted reforms in Eastern Europe and in Africa. They promoted that. They were saying capitalism, look at what do you think socialism is bringing you? It brings you Tanzania. It brings you the collapse. It brings you, and so on. So it would be different, arguably. So it would still go the same direction, more or less. But of course, nowadays, anyway, it's a good question, but it's The important thing is also African agency, right? So you can still think about to what extent would the African governments or particular parties or particular leaders be willing, able to sustain a non-capitalist project, right? Or would they eventually also say, okay, fine, we join, or we're also interested in this. They have their own investment, or they are very loaded, right? I mean, we're now in the era where some of the African presidents like Museveni, Ruto, they are billionaires, US billionaires, kind of, especially Museveni, right? So that might have still happened anyway, but who knows? But the trend, of course, is that the West is very good at killing all the alternatives. There are many books on that. Yeah, they kill, they assassinate, they kill the leaders. Anyone who critiques Western imperialism, who really tries to put something else on the road, etc., gets attacked. Yeah. So, all right. Any other question about this part? And maybe what do you think was productive about this?
Well, that was my question. So alternative models and alternative ideologies, because there seems to be like this wave of assumption that we took along that the market as a single most important economic unit is right and just, yeah. But we know that comes from Adam Smith, right? We know that. But no one seems to challenge that root. No one seems to challenge that foundation to zoom out and maybe think about, I don't want to use the word kind of like a moral capital or something like that, but what then do we take as the most single economic unit to put on the table as an alternative to build social structures?
So markets, and I looked again at Bernard's, it's in your slides, yeah, that I will share as well. So he had a book on poverty and finance and so on. So he then summarized again what he thinks is neoliberalism. And he said again, this idea that markets are the solution to social problems, right? So you just need more markets, and if you have a problem here, you have another market, another foreign entity, corporation, let them handle the energy sector and so on. So that is still what the alternatives. There's a whole literature on that, but I mean, it's very hard to challenge these commercial logics and corporations and so on. I mean, some people talk about at least you need local appropriation, so you need local capitalism. So there's one way to say there's all this TNCs, foreigners dominate Uganda kind of capitalism, right? But you can't even do a capitalism where you have strong domestic capitalists. That would even be an anti-project, because Museveni is so tied to, right? The current ruling party is so tied to foreign capital. So even then, to say that that's a wrong path and you should kick many of these, like Amin style, kick some of them out, or tell them that's your time is up. We now have indigenous capitalists. That even is seen to be too subversive and radical.
Or something like a non-for-profit or a social business or something.
Yeah, I mean, all that can exist, I think, and can be done, and you can have worthwhile interventions and so on. But so at the state level, we see that at the moment they just keep commercializing. That's and giving space to capital and so on. So, and then we can follow cases where now maybe like in Uganda they say don't always give it to the foreigners. Why do you give it to another foreign investor friend of yours? So even that is kind of where the politics of capitalism is kind of centering at the moment. You don't even talk socialism. You don't talk doing something radically different. You just want to have more the end of like dealing with the poverty issue by, we call it, appropriating the resources. So if you have the sugar, if you have the gold, the coltan, etc., not selling it at such a low price. So that even is the project that I think is of our lifetime. Does that make sense? That's what Yusuf Sankuma argues, right? So that you stop the increase of the neo-colonial condition. You stop the increase of the exploitation by foreigners and by capital and so on. But it's a bit like that. I mean, that's.
Can I put it another way? So say me and Bertie want to start a project, yeah, and we want to improve financial inclusion in Cote d'Ivoire, yeah, because we find in the rural areas, they have poor education and poor whatever, yeah. But then Bertie says to me as the co-founder of that project, oh, I'm going to go to ABSA to go and get the funding to do this project. But then in the conversation she's having with ABSA, they're going to tell her how to exploit, from a branding perspective, brand equity perspective, their own position as market leaders in these hegemonic forces. Yeah. What do I say to her that is damaging to the overall structure and system that's going to make her stop? And then what do I do with my project? Where do I go and get the money to actually start my project and get labor to do it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, whether you can find somebody also who has a bit more explicit, maybe anti-commercial, I don't know, pro-indigenous agenda. We're not cooperating, where you can put it up front. We if you, there's sometimes the demonstrations in Kenya, they were very strong, anti-West, anti-IMF, and so on, right? So, and they were saying we don't, so they were arguing for the alternatives, don't cooperate with the IMF, don't cooperate with the old forces, and so on, and the new colonial structures, and they were calling out the elites. So now you would have, like if you say explicitly also in terms of education and say, communication discourse, we are a project that is not cooperating for ABC reasons with ABSA and rejects such sponsorships. So I don't know. So it will be, when Elba now goes to do his film project, right? Will he give the product to California, or will he negotiate a better rate, or will he have his own distribution channel? So it's about owning the infrastructure to begin with, perhaps, and capturing the value, right? And not Coca-Cola franchise, franchise and the rest of it. So where do you get the money? I don't know. I mean, it's a bit like I'm part of a rope, right? A journal. We now have finished our relationship with a commercial journal, and they have given us a lot of money every year to be our partners and publish our journal. Now we have said we don't want to have this commercial relationships, and we be self-funded. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. So it's a bit like saying you can't have our product and make profit with it and put our content behind paywalls. We want to have open access and fully own it and so on. And now we have to go to foundations, and of course the foundations that come to mind are the Ford Foundation, so they're capitalist foundations. So, but that's then something you need to discuss and further see and maneuver. And also, like, you might take the money, but you might still do an anti-imperialist project, or you still build the radical analysts and so on, sort of thing. I don't know. But even like for me, for instance, right? So Ghana tried to do coffee differently, right? And they were resisted by the TNCs. The TNCs are screaming and attacking any attempt to change the system of value appropriation and how they make money from Africa, right? So even these little exercises of resisting and changing, I think for me highly interesting and worthwhile and praiseworthy and so on, and also following them what they yield. Yeah, and how often it's often a story of 2 years it's going well, but then eventually imperialism attacks you, and they have too many powers in their hand to sanction you, to commercially damage you, etc. And you have to go back and go into the system. So sort of story. We'll see. I don't know. It's.
I want to say one thing. Just add one thing. The power of crowdfunding and crowdsourcing for things generally, like in Kenya, after police had shot many people in the protests, like there's a young woman called Hanifa Adan who pulled off a crowdfunding for like, in the end, it was like about 250,000 euros that she was managing, that people had donated within like very few weeks. And I think there's a huge power in that, but yeah, it also depends on people volunteering their time and efforts to organize such a thing.
Yeah. And it's a bit like okay, so I don't have any smart final points on that, but it's a bit like Hunger Games again. So you have maybe a crowdsourcing once in a while, and then 250,000 come out of massive amount, and you get that case solved. But whether that changes system and structure and the fate of everybody, etc. But there's a lot of possibilities in there. It's still unbelievable that there's no proper African products shop in London, isn't it? In the center of London, where they just say, let's forget about all the supermarkets who sell our products, and we just have one supermarket where everything you spend here goes to source. plus our own financing our own infrastructure. So this kind of cutting out the middleman, the Western 50-80%, what they take, these coffee people and so on. That's worthwhile. I don't know what else. I mean, we'll see. Yeah, Nigel, anything you have another comment on that one? Or
No. It's the trap that we're all in, my friend. My
Yeah.
business is in it. I'm in it. You're in it, and I think we have to scratch our heads for a lot longer than we have here to come up with ideas. I love the crowdfunding idea. In fact, I was talking about that this morning with someone. But I think this is why we're here, right? To do this work, yeah.
Yeah. So crowdfunding now the question is like 250,000. What can you do that with that other than also sorting the case in the hospital or whatever? What can you do with 250,000 then to do something else? Yeah. So could one then use money if you could crowdfund, but for what? And how is that alternative? And how is that an example at least for an alternative?
I think where it has kind of where I have observed it working is in like the cultural context, where there's little money available and also like kind of funding independent things like music projects, album recordings, independent of like the big music companies and stuff. But I mean, it's a very small sector of society.
Yeah, so it's about still the anti-colonial struggle. I've just seen 2 documentaries about land in Kenya. So they trying to fund money to at least do films and investigations, etc., to call out the imperialist structures or these are critical movies. You can do that, but sometimes I warn that to sometimes say no one thing. So don't be sweeping too much, Nigel. You said earlier, no one thinks or no one has or this or that. I always tell my students, don't use no one. That's the trap. I find you one person who thinks about this and your argument is finished. So use softer phrases like many or the large segments of the population or something like that, or significant share. So again, we are trapped, yes, but again, like we have to use sometimes different analytical phrases to give us space to think a bit flexibly, yeah. So trapped in what way and what there's so many good examples as well. What people are, and sometimes also we don't know all these different activities where people are not trapped or trying to get out, right? It's anyway. So, but also many struggles. I mean, how people are resisting the system and resisting the status quo, and trying to change the status quo in something that is less corporate or less foreigners taking or the local elites taking stuff and so on. So that's worth at least checking out what that tells you for the questions you have about alternatives. And it's not just the theoretical possibilities, but also the practicalities, the politics of them, right? So that's also whenever, remember still Zucchini Park in New York? Remember that protest? Where's that gone? It was killed off. Beautiful, the capitalists tend to kill off any significant uprising. So do you remember that in New York?
This is the point that Professor Eze makes. So when you start these types of initiatives, then the monopoly of violence kicks in. So they will try and subvert you, but then in the end, if they don't, they'll just use violence. So you have to sometimes have like some kind of military element as well to your resistance struggle if you're going to survive. So
yeah, or yes, or at least say, I'm working in education. I want to. That's for instance in Kenya, Nairobi, the Mathare Social Justice Center. They have a library. So in the income poor area, they have a library where they have the books of the radicals. So at least they say we can't, we're funding libraries for that radical pro-alternatives education. So at least we keep the education alive, the spirit alive, while capital occupies us, while capital dominates, it's hegemonic. You can have a few days of riots in Nairobi, but then the state kicks in and you're finished. So, those things, and they might not lead to any political change, but at least you creating some sort of critical mass of thinkers and future protesters and future debate participants. And so I've seen Nairobi social justice intellectuals being on TV during the riots in Nairobi and so on. So, and they are running also libraries where they have explicitly anti-imperialist, the true history of colonialism, and how also the government kills people left, right, center. So resistance histories, and I think such projects are always worthwhile. to create spaces because, of course, they get attacked, right? And these are, I've just talked to somebody in Kampala, and if you're really one of the most radical Marxists, the state follows you and shuts you down wherever little space you open, where you try to do education and so on. So it's worth nevertheless fighting for these spaces, and then also for global connections. And just to keeping, you will not succeed, arguably. The hegemony is too big, but people can find you, students can find you, young people can find your analysis, your projects, and join you. And this, okay, yeah. But my point is also not to be sweeping and using these so big everybody, right? So sweeping means when you can where's your empirical proof? Yeah, and I can always find one example. So the way I learned this is when people say everybody loves peace. What's your proof? You can't prove that 7 billion love peace with all this war. So it's a sweeping argument to make. Yeah, everybody loves peace. So stuff like that. So sweeping is very dangerous, and you get better results for your intellectual health when we all try to find phrases. Well, it's a bit like my argument about there's also local popularity. You can endlessly study their entire life, the crisis, and how it's hated, and how people are, don't like capitalism. But also you can study and you can open up and say that people also love it. Some of them, many of them. They love materialism. They love this and that, right? So now we need to be open that there's another element to this. Why is capitalism surviving and hegemonic? Is because some people buy into it, and that's. But then why do they? It opens up further other questions. Lines of exploration. I always think about lines of explorations. This gives us particular lines of explorations that we can discuss. Okay, so all right, and. Of course, we're setting history, so nothing is determined. It's a bit like Matrix, a bit like Hunger Games, a bit like, okay, So, but anyway, let me do fintech.
I feel like just one final one to that, because I feel I was once in a class from an Ethiopian thinker, which I forgot. I was trying to remember her name, but she was talking actually about the connection between racism and capitalism, which is also very massive. And then she was saying something that I found really interesting, whereby she said that, of course, like everyone is like right now at the moment thinking that capitalism is the only existing model that can work, but it's basically not, because there were like times before where we didn't have it and societies were still like moving and thriving and blah blah. So maybe it's just about time to discover.
Yeah, but it's also not true. You can't theorize or just sometimes I get a bit tired of talk shows where people just talk the big questions, right? So what I mean by that is Harrison says early on that there's always other things going on in societies. It's not just capitalism. There are also other cultures, other things matter, right, and other behavioral motives and so on. So don't that's important. But and of course, climate will maybe arguably kill a lot of the capitalist power, right? And climate is the only one that can hit the US. I realized the other day, right? You can't have terrorism, and you can't have aeroplanes flying into New York, but the climate can create it. Of course, a climate catastrophe can level the places there, the infrastructure, yeah. So and imperialist power, the climate can smash imperialist the US. So stuff like that. People might be, I don't know. So there's floods, at the moment I also look at all these floods in Africa and other places. So but the survival economies might be at some point maybe different from the corporation being there and the factory being there and so on. So we'll see. But there are other systems, right? Other logics and other always there, relationships and so on. So that structure people's lives and so on. But capitalism is also there, clearly. But it might also be reducing for some people in some areas. So I don't know, when Sudan now is flooded, how many corporates are still there other than the mining companies? We'll see. All right. So my point now about fintech is that fintech has a lot of points to think through this politics and the question of power and the social harm, right? So it's power, profits, productive, this growth, etc., comes out of fintech, out of these M-Pesa and so on. But of course, there's also mental ill health. People get stressed from being on apps. Why are they on apps? Why do they need loans from M-Pesa? Because they don't have a job. So all these bigger questions as well. The stress, the suicides from apps, too many loans. But also it's a story about how the state and Safaricom and such big corporations, how they merge and how they are united in their interests, but also how you have slowly Safaricom taking up almost state functions, right? Where Safaricom provides money and funding for education, for sports. There's a catastrophe, there's flooding, Safaricom steps up, of course, in the name of CSR and image and so on, and also because the state maybe says you have the money, isn't it? Because we allow you to accumulate so much, so you have to fund us, etc. So particular power structure there, and a particular role of the TNCs in terms of the term might be statecraft. Yeah, so statecraft is not just so Museveni, and they all work with the TNCs, and they often have the TNCs at functions where MTN and others, they give them the infrastructure to broadcast anyway, but also they might give them the funding, they might give them the entertainment, the market, the radio shows. So it's endless combination, and they are kind of in the same team. And I want to highlight that and what that says about shifting politics, but also a particular state, corporate state, but also Safaricom as a kind of semi-state entity. Is that productive? Yeah, I hope that's productive. So let me try that. But I know toilet breaks are important. So let's have a 5-minute toilet break. Yeah, is it okay? Yeah, and then I have good slides, and I can just highlight a few things before I then also talk about the assignment, and we can talk again about capitalism and how to study it and how to keep sane and not be totalizing in these analytical kind of exercises one does. Okay, so 5 minutes break. Is that okay, Nigel?
Sorry, what did I miss?
Just 5 minutes toilet break.
Oh yeah. Oh, I just went for my drink. No problem.
Yeah. So 20 past. Yeah, short one, so that we try to finish by 8. Good. Okay, let me continue. So what about this issue of alternatives, right? So one interesting thing would be to think through our research also. On one hand, we know banana, coffee, and all these other traditional sectors, African actors don't take a lot of value, right? Their value appropriation is always below 10%. African actors or countries make less than 10% in coffee. But Burna Boy, Diamond Platinum, these mega stars of global entertainment, how much percentage does Burna Boy take if he sells his song for $1, right? So how much is his? How much it goes to California, to the other entities? So what does he then do with the money? And does he try to then reinvest into further value appropriation by African actors, right? His friends and business partners from Nigeria and others. So it's worth seeing how African actors navigate capitalism differently, and then for what end they use their profits and their wealth and their power. Does that make sense? So what projects does Burna Boy fund? On one hand, he has these wonderful songs, also one I have in a moment, about money is bad and so on, and you create the monster you made. But then one would have to see so what does he do with it? He has money. What does he do with it to put alternatives on the table, right? Does that make sense a bit? Yeah. So that's also something worth researching, also sharing them with alumni. What are practical examples of alternatives, and who, what, how, to what effect, etc. Is always worth collecting data on. Think also of South Africa. So you have anyway. So it's very hard to sometimes find alternative agencies. Okay, because often corporates they get called back into doing more things for the state, and you have more corporate dominance and hegemony day in and day out. So, but worth trying to find out what these new superstars that are making better, healthier profits, so to speak, right, and appropriating higher values, higher percentages in the industries vis-a-vis what Africans make in coffee and so on. What do they do with the profits? Politically and economically speaking. Good. So I share again, yeah, and also put some comments on what for you so far is productive and important now that you know this definition or this argument is good, productive. Let me know in the chat. I can follow that up later, not during the session, but afterwards. Yeah, it's always important to know which of the arguments kind of trigger rethinking and trigger insight. Yeah, or on the student side. So share screen. So next slides. Yeah, that's my. So fintech is big. There are lots of fintech summits, conferences, workshops. All the usual suspects are in a way there. UN, sitting with the government, sitting with the investors from Silicon Valley, sitting also with the investors from Cape Town, from Nairobi, and so on. So there's an intriguing mix of agencies, and of course, again, a lot of confidence in the PR. Right, this is the future. This will solve this technology will solve some of the major problems on the continent. So it's intriguing to unpack that and to spend some time about what is going on. Yeah, and fintech just is defined as the delivery of financial products and services through technology. And of course, the mobile phone is one of the key technologies that we are thinking here. It's basically moving the banks from the offline thing, right? The bank office and building and so on, to now in your phone, and then of course the loan application, everything online within 2 hours during the morning coffee, right? You have your loan 2 hours later. So all this is fintech, tech-based products and services around finance. So the story that how it arrived at my desk was the one from Bateman, right? How this is all exploitative, creating mayhem, but it's promised as a solution. There's data out there that poverty is reducing due to fintech. So there's a promise and positive story out there, and fintech and Bateman attacks that. So that's the first time I engaged with this story. I'm always intrigued by how much by the finance marketing, the posters, the slogans. Generally, you might pick an interest in studying advertisements in African cities. They're very intriguing, not much studied. So here is a picture I took. Yeah, you see, I went to a club, and then in the basement there was a car that said "Financial freedom in less than 6 hours." So they don't say a trap, right, Nigel? They say freedom. And of course, this is just, you just take the camera out and take a picture and say, I'm going to take that home and put it in my slides. Yeah. So, but M-Pesa's everywhere in some ways. Yeah. With these kiosks. So, and it's also about a story about platform capitalism. So this system, online capitalism, where a few commercial networks profit a lot from our user activities. Yeah. Uber, Airbnb are iconic platforms where some companies make a lot of money from us liking these apps, and they become dominant and exploitative, of course. But nevertheless, they remain there. So fintech came up from the late 2000s, mobile phone technology. So there's always a story of capitalism, is always also, and politics of capitalism is a story also of technology. Very important, right? Technology. And here again, fintech, yeah, and M-Pesa and Safaricom is all linked in the origin story to DFID. Yeah, DFID played a role. Vodafone, I think, British company. So DFID sponsored a little bit something, and then Vodafone, British TNC, and then Safaricom, and then M-Pesa was linked to that. And nowadays you have all sorts of big, neo-colonial and so on, imperialist agencies also in that space. Gates Foundation, Citibank, MasterCard, etc., but in bed with UN and so on entities. Yeah, they talk about financial inclusion and praising that and advancing that, together with MasterCard and others. So it's a story of all these things: aid, philanthropy, capitalism, super rich tycoons, post-coloniality, but also about African agency in this space. So it's not, that's the latest paper I found, the latest authors that I'm now liking and learning from and using in my own writing is Paul Yo and co-author, who say you can't reduce everything to neo-coloniality. There's more going on, and technology is non-deterministic, and Africans can do with that technology more than just handing over the profits to the northern companies. So that's an argument I will highlight at the very end. Yeah, so Kenya-based Safaricom's M-Pesa, but that's a bit like the case study, the success story that the neoliberals and the government elites and corporate elites and UN elites use to say, look, Africa can also do successes in capitalism. We're not just the mining and cobalt and whatever and Congo and child labor. We're also a global role model in this sector. But Bateman says a lot that Safaricom is owned by Vodafone, so it's owned by a foreign transnational. So what are you guys talking about? All these things that you have in Nairobi, where you giving phones and apps and loans to the poor, they're enriching the rich abroad and so on. So, and that's where he makes these arguments. In many ways, of course, convincingly, right? And here's an example of, for instance, family. Yeah, so M-Pesa also then says this is good for family. Use our app, and if you love your family, take insurance or do this and so on. So it's about this cultural merging, right, of family traditional values with now that's M-Pesa is what you need to live this value, sort of. Then there's a US side to all this. So there's Tala here, a major company based in the US somewhere, and they are also selling their profile and their company brand in the US to markets and to investors there and to the media and so on, and to the public as a story of helping Africans and with loans and so on, and financial inclusion, right, and empowerment. And if you look again at also these apps and their websites, I always recommend you go to these websites and check the PR and the pictures of capitalism, right? And how they talk about it. This is inclusion, this is the progress, this is helping, and so on. They are very good at the PR, isn't it?
Yeah.
And saying we are working day and night to solve these problems. Then the business press also talks a lot about these fintech hubs on the continent, and it's a positive story again, Nairobi, Cape Town, and others. Yeah, and so in our own work, we found when we analyzed the media, the optimism was very dominant. Yeah, the positive coverage was very dominant, and these spaces are full of actors. Right, so this is the boom. There are many actors in that space, in these fintech summits and conferences, and Kampala has them, and Cape Town has them, and Nairobi has them. See here, Tala raises 145 million to continue serving the poor, who are unbanked. Of course, and that's not Tala there, right? And Tala has big business in Nairobi, in Kenya. But how much will Tala tell you how much is the interest they charge? Okay, so that's again where you then go for the politics of this thing and the political economy of this. Right? You look here, Tala Engineering working to solve one of the world's toughest problems, etc. So you have all this corporate spin, unleash the economic power of the global majority. Yeah, we exist to unleash the economic power. So this is all matrix speak, isn't it? In some ways. And there will, yeah, and so on. But then you go on, okay, you go on. There's all positives. But then you find the critical stuff that talks about the suicide aspect and the social harm of this success story, so-called success story, and how people are suffering and how high the interest rates are and how this creates pressure and depression and really suicidal thoughts and the rest. So even the Guardian talked about this. Yeah, also about the practices of loan recovery. So agencies calling you in the morning, sending you intimidating messages, contacting your family and employer about how you were not repaying the loans and all these things. Then, of course, at some point, the Kenyan government restricted what lenders could do in terms of follow-up on their loan recovery and so on things, and how that they couldn't. People are blacklisted. Yeah, so imagine. People are being treated like criminals by these corporations, but then eventually the state said you can't blacklist Kenyans anymore. But part of the election was to say we're having more progressive policies than that in place. All right. And here then you have the interest rates a little bit, yeah, in one of the readings here. So you're talking about Tala, 148%. So that's the one figure that changes the entire story, isn't it? And reveals the politics and reveals the accumulation and reveals the underbelly and reveals and gives you an insight, a starting point to now unpack this much more critically than the PR.
What
allows.
did you say? 148% interest rate?
Yeah.
Is that real? There must be a typo.
No, the thing with those loans is that it amounts to that in the end. It's because like you get a very big amount in the beginning, and then you pay back every month. But like you have the amount you have to pay back in the end, it amounts to like more than double of what you have borrowed.
Ah, okay. So this is the total compounding effect of that loan.
Yeah, that's what happens when like Uber drivers in Nairobi buy cars.
Right.
They buy them, and with the loan, they end up paying more than double the amount it would have been if they would have bought it cash.
Got you.
Exactly. So, of course, I don't have time to research all these figures, right? But this is a solid report that, yeah, except if you calculate as an annual basis, right, then you get that kind of figure. But it looks very realistic because the official bank loans, etc., they're starting at 2025, right? So these are micro loans, apps, vulnerable people doing small, sums, but they have hefty payback kind of dynamics. Yeah, that's what this is trying to tell us. That all this Silicon Valley, that what Teller's telling us they're helping is actually not the case. They're helping maybe on the first night, but there's a price to pay next morning. Yeah? So, and you can then find out what are the other guys charging and how can you maybe run an alternative to that. And if you, in some ways, mobilize a project that says, guys, we have loans at, the Kenyan government, they had their loan system, right? There's, what do they call it again? Where they give credit at 20%.
The Hustler Fund.
Yeah, so the Hustler Fund, right, was about 20 or 15%. So even that is almost like revolutionary to offer money at low rates that where the corporates would say we can't have this expanding. If these guys expand with their 5%, say Socialist Nigel et al., yeah, in Nairobi, and then you will be taken down sooner or later, maybe, or you know what I mean? So because these figures are political, so if you're expanding a model that shows for some reason there's money in this world that can be given at 5% or 2%, there will be a political fight against you, arguably. So even there you can think about alternatives. How do you organize in a meaningful, significant, right? Not just small scale for one village, but something for entire society. Sort of a competitor, serious competitor for these corporates along those sides. Yeah, that is a more healthy, whatever figures and healthy loans and so on. So then Donovan and Park give you also an anthropological study here about the intimacy of this. Yeah, so they start the article with somebody saying it's kind of like a bad habit. Yeah, it's kind of sin on one hand because I know it's bad, but also I need it. I like it. I like how it solves my problem today, and I worry about this tomorrow. So the borrower is also heavily not sure how to feel and whether to love or hate or both at the same time and so on. Yeah. So the intimacy of this is also very individualized. Yeah. The borrower is at home and making the deals with the apps. Okay. Not even having to leave home. Of course, being then also traumatized and left alone with the harm and the psychological impact and the economic situation on their hand. Okay. So, but you see here, there's a whole different coverage as well. Yeah. Outrage over debt collector, shaming tactics, and so on. Cyberbullying. And that's a global phenomenon, right? It's not just Kenya. I've seen also articles about this in India, suicide, and then also measures to help people to recover from suicidal thoughts thanks to apps and so on. Okay. That's, I think, India, right? Isn't it? A case of online loan apps harassment led to suicides in modern Bharat. So it's kind of global capitalism, right? Africa capitalism, global capitalism. And these companies, they operate, of course, and their business models, they are global models. Debt shaming laws. So you can study all that. It's all the politics of fintech in a very, and therefore of new capitalism, and therefore of the post World War, post Cold War era, right? It's this new configuration of social order. You see it also on the top right side. Clearbank selects suicide prevention charity campaign against living miserable to be charity partner. So you might now have corporates that say, we know it's a bit dangerous, we know there's problems, and we will fund some kind of anti-suicide charity work and so on. So it gets again as matrixy type as that. Okay, so I don't want to spend on the debate. On one hand, there's the debate about this is all colonial and bad, and exploiting and the poor, and then the other side says this poverty reduction, this is the way forward, this is helpful. But as I say, I don't want you to, in my given little time, that's not my core point. You can go through that all on your own time, yeah? But the government will say fintech is wonderful, and the UN as well. They call it financial inclusion, and they have now financial inclusion aims in their official government policy, where they say we want financial inclusion with fintech's help. And of course, partly sometimes these fintech-related comments in the national budget and so on speech is written by some donor entity, yeah. So DFID always has still in Kenya and Uganda projects about financial inclusion, and then they are in close collaboration with government, and they help writing such statements, and they then also say it openly on their website. So, but that's not my point. My point is this one here, right? Emma about the Emma Park, about Safaricom and this corporate nation state, and then Polio now also talking about fintech as more than just neo-colonial. So in their work, and we'll talk about that in a moment, they say, I get to that in a moment. This is Bhagats' work, yeah. It's very interesting. But this is now my newest, my final slide, and then I open up for discussion. So we call it techno-political Afro-optimism, right? So we wonder how is fintech used to make arguments about Afro-optimism? So it's a bit like what my interest in Burna Boy as a story of Afro-optimism, a different engagement, and how people manage capitalism. Now here they say that fintech is a technology that will help us to do a different development that breaks with the path of the last 30, 40 years where we just neo-colonially get exploited, right? And here we have something that also includes people. The argument is we had so much unevenness, so much exclusion. Our capitalism is very unfair and excluding large sections of society who don't have health, who don't have a technology, let alone a bank account. But here we have now fintech, and that is creating inclusion. Large section of society can now have a phone, maybe built by the Chinese, but nevertheless at cheap rate, and then even also have an online this and that saving account, pension account to receive money from the family abroad, and so on. So it's there's an inclusion claim, right? And that, as I said already, Safaricom is used and M-Pesa is used as an argument about we can handle this technology. We can have coding for the world to lead, or at least for the continent. When we are coding in and writing programs for fintech in Nairobi, we can then export it, and then in a way also provide that solution that comes from that coding work of our coders in Nairobi to the continent, right? So it's a bit like the arguments about technology and Africa and progress. So Kirola talks about the Africa's relationship with technology. So it's a really intriguing argument. And they say you can't have this too deterministic. But what you can do with technology is, of course, the local state. So they use Rwanda. They say Kigali. Kigali uses the technology to organize the economy, to organize the city. So they say the urban state, Kigali, Cape Town, etc., uses fintech and uses such platforms to do, to organize the city better, in their view, to maybe collect taxes, to formalize people. But so different things that you might say, yeah, that's progressive, and that's what Africa optimism, and that's a new Africa that gets created thanks to, right? So they have different projects that use fintech technology. In Kampala, differently to Kigali, to Cape Town. Okay, so it's a very good argument and very good data they have. So they're saying fintech might bring about a different position of Africa in the world. Is not so colonial. We can do coding, and we can maybe even exclude the foreigners in many ways, or reduce their importance and reduce how much we have to pay them to use their platforms. Yeah, and we can create new sectors, because if you can deliver the food from the shopping center to home for the middle class or whatever, that's an economic activity. You have jobs now that are not there before, and so on. heightened independence. So, and then also this is tied to projects and imaginations of independence and sovereignty. So we have our own security maybe now tied to some sort of fintech technology or technology, right? Generally platform capitalism and so on stuff. And so that's what self-determination and independence is about, to own some of these technologies, to have our own, maybe TikTok, yeah, African TikTok, Nigerian TikTok, and so on, and make money from it and own it and be less dependent and less kind of just colonial.
But I mean, in the end, it's also a bit like the financial inclusion delusion, right? Because most like the apps I'm using in my daily life in Nairobi are like Uber or Bolt, which are foreign owned, which is foreign owned. Like, I mean, the possibility is there, but still to develop something that can compete with those international service providers, like the capital that is needed is hardly available for African founders.
Correct. But you might have the apps and the projects that are even if, say, Kenyan Nairobi City Council would develop their own app to do ABC, and I don't know. So they argue that you can't just run the neo-colonialists, all the foreign companies forever in the same way. It's more vibrant, it's more dynamic. They make an argument. Does that make sense a bit?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So here's Park. I just want to give you briefly a long quote here from Park and Donovan. So how they phrase it. It also took me some time to understand what they're saying, but they say here, Kenyan nationalism and commercial branding is entangled. So they talk about the Safaricom Stadium is now owned by, so have a read maybe. Okay, so maybe before it was used, the stadium they talk about was called maybe Moi Stadium, and now it's called Safaricom Stadium, and so on. Yeah. Now again, Kenyan pride might now in part be built on that Safaricom global success story. We have strong runners, and we are the ones who give the world M-Pesa, because we had the quotas, we had the eyes for this market. We were the first. Our model and so on revolutionized. So you might have that, and Safaricom would cultivate that. Yeah, we are Kenya and so on, and they also have to do a very particular politics that is not so close to the typical ethnic divisions, but portrays Safaricom as being a bit independent of that, and a kind of national brand, a national entity for national development and sovereignty and the Kenyan future and so on. Meanwhile, they of course are in many ways a foreign entity. Yeah. Okay. So, but it is productive, right? Like many companies, Safaricom has a philanthropic foundation that provides goods traditionally considered the responsibility of modern states: education, health service, clean water. Kenyans expect them to step in and to engage in state-like actions. I think I like that a lot. So I could analyze the rest of my days just the exploitative nature of Safaricom, or I could look at how Safaricom performs functions of the state and what that tells about power and changing, statecraft and citizen-state company relations and so on.
I also, just a small addition because it fits so well, the Safaricom colors are the colors of the national flag. Wow. Like it uses green, red, black, and white.
Okay, good.
Everything. And it's like, it's so deeply connected.
Yes, and in Uganda, MTN has yellow, and the NRM color is yellow.
Okay, but MTN is a French company that had yellow forever, right?
Yeah, but intriguing, it works well. Because Museveni is happy, of course, that if MTN sponsors, they always sponsor on yellow. Everything is yellow, and the NRM color is yellow. So, but you see this, right? So, and they're one of the few people who argue that like that, and who had very early on their eyes on this topic and this kind of feature. It's only one feature of the many politics of this app, yeah, and of fintech. You can study the suicide, you can study the exploitation, the rates, the elites having shares and getting good payout from the foreign entity, all that. But also you could look at these kind of things that are a bit different level of politics. And then Kirolia, as I said, and Polio, they talk about this other fintech frontiers and how basically how there are many different projects on the road with this technology, not just let's make big money from the poor or from Kenyans, etc. So the urban state in Cape Town and in Kigali uses this technology and the possibility it brings to do statecraft. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then you can still qualify and say it's still basically, guys, you know what you're talking about. You're still exploiting. So they're saying, yes, it's exploitative, arguably. Yes, that is neocolonial. Yes. But alongside that, you have other stuff going on. I just want to show you that argument. Yeah. And that's maybe my end. And my assessment would be, and then of course we can discuss any questions and I answer maybe some or offer my own comment. So what does fintech tell us about the politics of the new capitalism in Africa? Okay, that would be my assessment question, sort of. And you have many options, and you can just select maybe one and try to bring some data or some little bit of do your own little research as well, where you sum up that one aspect dimension of politics of fintech.